Can the Second Amendment and modern America coexist? What was the original intent of the right to a regulated militia and the right of the people to keep and bear arms? How have Supreme Court decisions defined the Second Amendment? These are the questions we will answer in this podcast series called The Right to Bear Arms in Modern America. I am Harriet Taylor Wollstonecraft, with original content by R. Smith. In Part 2 of The Right to Bear Arms in Modern America, the Supreme Court changes course, reversing ideas found in previous decisions, and we discuss the original intent of the Second Amendment as it was written. In 2008, a case reached the Supreme Court docket that dismantled previous court cases' claims that while Congress could not infringe upon the right to bear arms, states did have the power to regulate and restrict gun ownership. The 14th Amendment did a lot to further the individual rights of American citizens while simultaneously stripping states of their autonomy from the prescriptions imposed upon Congress that are found in the Constitution and its amendments. District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008 made it clear that states had little say in the direction of modern gun policy. The case also reversed the ideas found in previous Supreme Court decisions that the Constitution intentionally aligned and attached the right to keep and bear arms with the right to maintain a well-regulated state militia. The complaint began after Dick Heller, a District of Columbia special police officer authorized to carry a handgun while performing his duties at the Federal Judicial Center, attempted to register a personal handgun that he intended to keep at his D.C. home. The District of Columbia denied his request under a provision found in D.C.'s Firearms Control Act of 1975. Heller took the case to court, claiming that two provisions in the Firearms Control Act violated his constitutional rights under the Second Amendment. One of the provisions prohibited the possession of handguns, and the second one required that lawful firearms in the home be unloaded and disassembled or trigger-locked. After Heller's case made the rounds in the lower courts, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the two local gun laws violated the Constitution. The decision had opposition, though, as the Supreme Court justices voted 5-4 in favor of Heller. The majority of the court ruled that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in the militia, and that individuals had the right to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. However, 4 of the 9 justices disagreed, and, as one might assume, known political ideals divided the chamber. 2 of the dissenting justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Gerald Breyer, were appointed by Democratic presidents. John P. Stevens and David Souter cast the other dissenting votes, and while Republican presidents appointed them, they both voted reliably with the court's liberal members. In fact, in 2003, a statistical analysis of voting patterns showed that Stevens had become the most liberal member of the court. Those justices siding with Heller were all appointed by a Republican president and included John Roberts, Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, Anthony Kennedy, and Antonin Scalia. When Justice Scalia delivered his ruling opinion to the court, which interpreted certain measures of the Second Amendment, he set out to make his reasoning clear, as it veered from previous court decisions. First, he said that the original delegates that ratified the Second Amendment wrote it to be understood by the voters. Its words and phrases were used in a normal and ordinary way. Therefore, they exclude secret or technical meanings that would not have been known to ordinary citizens in the founding generation. Next, Scalia declared that the framers of the Second Amendment divided it into 2 parts. The first part secures the right of the people to a well-regulated militia. The second secures the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The two do not work in unison. They are separate ideas, according to Scalia. The District of Columbia argued that the Second Amendment was one complete idea, stating that only members of a militia had the right to bear arms. Justice Scalia thwarted that notion even though it had Supreme Court case precedent. Scalia said that the right of the people refers to individual rights and belongs to all Americans. Third, he also clarified numerous terms found in the Second Amendment in order to definitively define the phrase keep and bear arms. According to two popular dictionaries of the era in which the delegates created the Constitution, keep meant to retain, not to lose, and to have in custody, as well as to hold, to retain in one's power or possession. The dictionaries defined bear to mean carry. The word arms meant weapons of offense or armor of defense, and anything that man wears for his defense, or takes into his hands, or useth in wrath to cast at or strike another. Therefore, the term arms is not specific to military use. And he concluded that keep and bear arms means to have weapons in custody and carry for offense. Finally, Scalia explained that just as modern forms of communication are included in the First Amendment and modern forms of search are included in the Fourth Amendment, the Second Amendment extends arms to include all instruments that constitute modern forms of bearable arms, even those not in existence when the country's founding fathers created the amendment. In 2010, in McDonald v. City of Chicago, the Supreme Court found another local gun restriction law to be in violation of the Constitution by a 5-4 vote. Again, a municipality banned the registration of a handgun to a law-abiding citizen, and the same District of Columbia v. Heller Court justices presided over the case. With the exception of newly appointed Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who replaced David Souter and was an appointee of President Barack Obama. Again, votes fell along the lines of known political ideals of liberalism and conservatism, and the Supreme Court deemed the local law unconstitutional. The dissenting opinion in the District of Columbia v. Heller decision came from Stevens and Breyer. Stevens said that the Second Amendment creators never meant to protect an individual's rights to keep and bear arms outside of the context of military service, and they never intended to limit the government's authority to regulate civilian use or possession of firearms. Stevens called the majority decision strained and unpersuasive as well as overwrought and novel. Breyer took a different approach than Stevens in his dissent, contending that if the Second Amendment provides for an individual's right of self-defense as argued, that municipalities in urban areas where gun crime and gun violence are extensive should be able to regulate firearms to protect citizens. Therefore, gun control laws can be consistent with Second Amendment rights if the constitutional provision's intent is to provide citizens a measure of self-defense. Similar dissenting opinions by Stevens and Breyer followed the McDonald v. City of Chicago decision, and their opinions use key evidence found in the manuscripts of James Madison to validate their points. Justice Stevens places significance on James Madison's inclusion of a conscientious objector clause in an early draft of the Second Amendment, which delegates later removed. Madison writes, "But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person," and Stevens argued that the phrasing and the idea by Madison establishes that the meaning of bear arms refers only to military service. Moving forward, two more cases further protected the individual right to keep and bear arms. First, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court upheld a state law that prohibited the possession of stun guns. In their examination, the court considered whether stun guns fall under the category of weapons protected by the Second Amendment as envisioned by Congress in 1789. The Massachusetts court concluded that stun guns are not protected because they were not commonly used during the time of the Second Amendment's enactment. Additionally, the court deemed stun guns to be inherently dangerous and uncommon, and found no evidence to suggest their adaptability for military use. However, in 2016, in Kitano v. Massachusetts, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned this ruling, reaffirming that the Second Amendment applies to all bearable arms, including those that did not exist during the founding era. The U.S. Supreme Court also rejected the notion that only weapons useful in warfare are protected. Finally, we get to 2022 in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. At the time, the state of New York made it a crime to carry a concealed pistol or revolver outside of one's home unless an individual provided evidence of a valid reason for self-protection that sets them apart from the general community. However, New York residents who were denied unrestricted licenses based on their general interest in self-defense challenged this requirement. The Supreme Court reversed the decision, 6-3, ruling that the proper cause requirement violates the 14th Amendment, saying that the law prevents citizens with ordinary self-defense needs from exercising their Second Amendment right to bear arms for self-defense while in public. The court stated that the constitutional right to bear arms in public for self-defense is not a second-class right, subject to an entirely different body of rules than the other Bill of Rights guarantees, and that the exercise of other constitutional rights does not require individuals to demonstrate to government officers some special need. James Madison initially wanted to incorporate the amendments to the Constitution into the text of the original document. However, other delegates disagreed with the idea, and in the end, Madison and Company attached the Bill of Rights to the tail of the Constitution. Madison and crew arranged the 10 amendments in a particular order, and many people today consider the Founding Fathers' high placement of the Second Amendment within the first 10 amendments as a measure of its importance. Amendment 1, many argue, is the most important of the amendments because it makes it clear that the federal government could not establish a national religion and could not suppress the right to free speech, the right to a free press, the right to peaceful assembly, or the right to petition the government. Right after it, we find Amendment 2, appearing to many as a continued narrative on individual rights. However, there is more evidence that shows that the delegates ordered the amendments according to how they would naturally fit within the existing composition of the Constitution and not ordered by perceived importance. For example, the First Amendment relates to the powers of the legislature and begins with Congress shall make no law, so its placement would naturally occur after Article 1, Section 8, which begins with Congress shall have power, and within Article 1, Section 9, which is a list of prescriptions. Because the Second, Third, and Fourth Amendment also limit what Congress has the power to do, they would also fall into Article 1. Article 2 of the Constitution moves on to executive power, but there are no amendments within the Bill of Rights that pertain to the executive branch. Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the court system, so Amendments 5 through 8 fall into that section because they deal with juries, bail, and cruel and unusual punishments. Amendments 9 and 10 would be a postscript to the Constitution because they deal with the interpretation of the Constitution and the other amendments in their entirety. The conundrum is how the Second Amendment slides between the two ideas found in the First and Third Amendments. The First Amendment clearly deals with the individual rights of the people to particular freedoms that include religion, speech, press, assembly, and government petition. The Third Amendment deals with power of Congress during war, providing that Congress could not quarter soldiers in the homes of citizens. In the middle, we have the Second Amendment that discusses a militia like those found in Lexington and Concord, where the first battle of the Revolutionary War began. The colonial militias were autonomous groups that self-trained in weapons, tactics, and strategy several times each year and were responsive to threats against their territory from any enemy that might venture into their town. That threat eventually became the British Redcoats, and the militias held their own during the prologue of war as the Continental Army formed to coordinate the military efforts of all the colonies during the Revolutionary War. The importance of the militia to those early American delegates is obvious. Before the Continental Army organized to a full realization under George Washington, the only line of defense in colonial America was the individual militia groups that dotted the landscape. Coming back to the Second Amendment, the question for some becomes, why is the idea of a well-regulated militia coupled with the right of the people to keep and bear arms? The argument for those in the gun control quarters is that if the right to bear arms is an individual right, it would be found in the First Amendment where individual rights are targeted in a clear and meaningful way. Instead, Madison and his men placed the right to bear arms after those First Amendment rights and coupled it with the delegate stance on militias. Next time, in Part 3 of The Right to Bear Arms in Modern America, we dissect militias and how they were defined in the original Constitution, ponder the mischaracterized intent of the Second Amendment, and end the series with a look into the inspiration behind the Second Amendment and its application today. I am Harriet Taylor Wollstonecraft with original content by R. Smith, and this has been a Balefire podcasting production. Thanks for listening. Until next time, enjoy the moment. Harriet Taylor Wollstonecraft is the AI-generated voice of Christy Carlo, a professional communicator found at christycarlo.com. Consent to use Christy's AI-generated voice has been granted by purchase through Jenny by Lovo, a voice production platform.